Hello everybody, this is Bismarck from the channel Military Aviation History, here with an emergency episode for Bernhard, whom you were probably expecting to hear. Now Bernhard, against my better advice, decided to take one of those shiny new Panzer tanks to the Eastern Front instead of flying there like a civilized person, and he is currently stuck in the mud with a broken transmission. In any case, it seems to be getting better for him now, and I'm sure he'll be back with us soon, and we wish him the best for his recovery. Now today I am joined by Justin. Hello Justin.
Hello, everybody.
He doesn't really need an introduction either on my channel nor on Bernhard's. He's been a great help in the past for both of us. Anything related to Japanese aviation and naval matters. In fact, Justin did publish an article a couple of months ago about the history of Japanese aircraft designs prior to World War II. And I also know that he's working on another article that as we speak. So we were definitely looking forward to that. Now, in any case, we thought we'd turn our attention today to the air war of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, in this point, we will be focusing primarily on the period of 1937 to 1941, because, well, the latter year, 1941, kind of presents an organic cutoff point, since obviously at that point, at the end of the year, the overall situation changes quite drastically for Japan when they decided to make an unannounced excursion to Hawaii. Now, in fact, I'd say that the period of 1937 to 1941 is, in fact, the one you should be looking at if you want to understand the Japanese way of conducting aerial warfare, since it was really that final puzzle piece in their transformation of both the Japanese Army's Air Force and, of course, the Japanese Naval's Air Force that were made before, well, the situation escalated with Pearl Harbor. Now, Justin, just to quickly set the scene here, what exactly happened in 1937 that kicked off this whole affair?
Yeah, so the Japanese and Chinese had pretty much been kind of fighting back and forth since 1931, on and off. What happened in July 1937 was the infamous Marco Polo Bridge incident. And what this, I'm not going to go into the specifics of the incident. Basically, the Japanese had an unannounced exercise. One of their soldiers went AWOL. They started complaining that obviously the Chinese had something to do with it, and fighting started. And then the next day, that soldier actually had turned up. It didn't really matter because fighting just continued to spiral out of control. And what ended up happening was what amounted to a full-scale invasion of the rest of China, because they'd already occupied Manchuria, started to occur. And then another important month in 1937 was August 1937, where a similar small incident started in Shanghai, and that escalated into another full-scale battle. So there was basically two fronts, a northern front and a kind of a central China front that would start in 1937.
Yeah, these two fronts are actually quite important because they also represent a certain natural divide that we'll be going into with both the Army's Air Force and the Navy's Air Force. Now, to kind of give you guys an overview of what we're talking about in the amount of scale of the aerial aspect of this. Now, Justin, if I ever make a mistake here, you please correct me. But some basic numbers here. Now, in 1947, the Japanese Army has a capacity of roughly 1,000 planes. Now, these numbers are a little bit disputed, especially when it comes to the ones that are actually operationally ready for the whole campaign. With roughly the figures I found, somewhere between 500 to 600 are operational at this point. There are 15 regiments with roughly 52 squadrons, and 5 of those regiments are actually a part of the Guangdong Army. Can you just briefly explain what the Guangdong Army is?
Yeah, so the Guangdong Army, they're kind of Japan's bad bunch. The army in general was quite disobedient. The Guangdong Army in particular was kind of a breeding ground for this kind of disobedience. But primarily, at least in this point, the Guangdong Army was concerned with keeping control of Manchuria. So at least what's implying there is that at least 5 of these air regiments would have been sitting in Manchuria staring down the Soviets, at least initially.
Yeah. And then, of course, we have the Navy. Now, you got to remember for the whole part of World War II, and also at this point already, of course, although some people might actually argue, and they wouldn't be too much wrong, that World War II, in fact, started right here at this point in time. But we, of course, have the Navy, the Japanese Navy Air Force. And they have roughly 600 planes at the moment, 800 if you include their reserves, with 13 of those being land groups, so land-based air regiments. And then we have 32 carrier groups. Now, the carriers that are specifically of interest here are Hosho, Kaga, and Rujo, because I think Akagi at this point is being refitted or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It's getting a full reconstruction.
Exactly. And then we have also Naturo and Kamoi. Did I pronounce that right? Those are seaplane carriers.
Yeah, you actually did a decent job.
Okay. A decent job is good enough, I guess. So we're talking essentially, depending on what kind of figures you want to talk about, we're talking about an air force that is facing down the Japanese of at least 1,000 operational aircraft, around about that figure. Now, the Chinese at this point, actually, before we talk about the Chinese here, the Japanese at this point are completely remodernizing their air fleet. In 1930, they had roughly 5,000 air crews. Right now, they're already sitting on roughly 10,000, so that essentially they doubled the amount of personnel they have for their services. But that's not the only thing they're doing at the moment. They're completely revamping and modernizing the air fleet. And maybe Justin, you can say something about that specifically for the aircrafts, what they're doing at the moment.
I won't get into too many specifics, but in very brief, the Army and Navy were kind of awkwardly caught. I always describe it as the invasion or the escalation of the war in China was not like some kind of Operation Barbarossa and like all this planning and things like that. It kind of happened by mistake, and it's very complicated. I'm grossly oversimplifying it, but in short, the Japanese Navy and Army Air Services were kind of caught with their pants down as far as equipment was concerned. For example, the Army's they had the Ki-10 in service, which was a respectable biplane. The Ki-27 hadn't turned up yet. Their bomber fleet in particular was quite obsolete by this point. They were kind of making do with bombers that had entered service in kind of the early 1930s. And the Navy, similarly, particularly their carrier-based aircraft, were still undergoing modernization. This is before the famous B-5N Kate, as it's often known, or the D-3A, the Val. And the A-5M was just starting to enter service. And really, out of all the aircraft, the only one that's was actually first-rate by international standards at this point was the G3M, which had also very recently entered service.
Okay, so having done the Japanese, then just having set the scene briefly there, let's talk about China. Now, China at this point, the Chinese Air Force, even though we are going to probably during this discussion call them the Chinese Air Force, they do not represent a unified service. Just like there is this kind of fraction or schism with the Japanese between the Army and the Navy, there is a whole bunch of small little personal air fleets that specific regions or warlords actually command. At the same time, there is, in theory, this kind of overarching Chinese Air Force that does exist. But again, in practical terms, the cooperation between these different regiments and fighter wings and bomber formations and so on, squadrons, is very limited. This also means that the overall standardization in the Chinese Air Force, again, there's that overarching term, Chinese Air Force, there is no real standardization. They have Italian planes, they have German planes, they have American planes, they have British planes, they have anything they can really get their hands on, or anything that for some questionable means were acquired. So we have a very fractured, a very decentralized, a very even logistically speaking, suboptimal Air Force, who are sitting on, all things considered, roughly 300 aircraft. So on the one side, again, we have the Japanese. They're undergoing a certain amount of transformation at the moment. And they have the Army and the Navy, and together that represents maybe roughly 1,000, 1,200 operational aircraft. And then we have the Chinese with 300 aircraft on the other side. Some of them quite modern, actually. Some of their aircraft were relatively up to par. And then you have this plethora of completely outdated machinery. And from any kind of equipment they have, they don't have enough. It's 20 fighters of this kind, 30 bombers of this kind, 10 bombers of this kind, 5 fighters of this kind. It's a mess. Anyway, let's get into the actual fighting. What's going to happen right now is, of course, the invasion or the fighting starts with the Kongtu army up in the north. What exactly happens with the Air Force part there?
Well, initially, as this incident starts to escalate, there's actually a directive that kind of assigns different areas of responsibility. So in the North China area, the Army Air Force gets primary responsibility. And then eventually, when things start blowing up around Shanghai, the Navy gets kind of that jurisdiction. Now, there's some overlap and stuff, but we're not going to. So, in very general terms, that's kind of it. Army in the north, Navy in kind of central China.
Yeah.
Now, the Army, going into this conflict, actually had a doctrine that we don't know a lot about in English, but we know a little bit, enough to basically sketch it out. And you could kind of see it too, just reading up on their air campaigns. And that was something they called the, quote, aerial extermination action, which is a really fancy way of basically saying what in modern terms you would call like offensive counter-air. They wanted to destroy the enemy's air force, and then once the enemy's air force had been destroyed, they would then switch to a direct army support role. So, just attacking frontline units. I've read accounts of what we would call interdiction, further behind the lines. They did a lot of when at this point in the war, the Japanese are really smashing the Chinese. So Chinese units are kind of disintegrating and fleeing, and that's when aircraft would come in and start hitting all of these fleeing units and things of that nature.
With maybe also to break it down and to explain a little bit how this natural divide came between the army air force being in the north and of course the Navy being in the center. It's also kind of makes strategically sense in a certain manner of speaking. The army, of course, deployed in the north, so their air force is going to cover their own guys, whereas the Navy has to keep in mind kind of the maritime interests here. And they see it as well in such a case that if they strike at the center and perhaps even the south of China, they can then control the maritime routes there. So for them, this makes a lot of sense as well. Just this kind of natural divide between what they're doing. Of course, on the flip side is that even though there are some instances where both services cooperate quite closely with one another, most of the time they operate very much independently. And you could perhaps even argue that in the later months, when we're going to talk about 38, 39, and in the 40s as well, maybe a little bit more cooperation between the services would actually have been quite helpful. Now, how did it actually start for the Japanese? The Japanese Air Force, both the Army and the Navy, did they have a good start to the war? Did they have run into unexpected problems? What was going on there?
Well, in very brief, in the north, the Army Air Service wasn't running into an overwhelming amount of opposition. So initially, at least, and air operations in the north were also relatively small scale. When things blew up around Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek made the conscious decision, and his German advisors, to fight what would amount to basically a decisive battle around in the Shanghai area. The battle is actually huge. It was the largest battle fought in an urban center before Stalingrad. It's just massive. And what the Chinese Air Force is thrown into this combat pretty much wholeheartedly. As people should probably know, the capital of nationalist China was Nanjing, and Nanjing is very close to Shanghai in central China. So this is where the at least from the Japanese perspective initially, this is where if we get Nanjing, we might be able to win the war. And from the Chinese perspective, they're trying to protect their capital as best they can. And in these initial engagements around Shanghai, initially the Japanese mount some very impressive, what historians often call quote-unquote transoceanic bombing missions, or what it is naval air groups made up of land-based attack aircraft, which was the designation for their G3Ms, their medium bombers. They were based on Taiwan and in Kyushu, the southernmost main island of Japan, and they were launching missions against targets in central China, primarily airfields. This is a very impressive feat, actually, for 1937. I mean, the round trip for some of these was, I think, it was 1,150 miles or something like that.
It's incredibly impressive, not just from the kit, but if you think about it, it's probably also the first time that was done in that sense, and the operational planning that actually was involved in those kind of operations. You think about it at the end of the war, of course, in 1945, stuff like this, the distances that were involved in kind of these bombing attacks, this kind of stuff seems like it's natural, but in 1937, it certainly isn't.
Yes. And while these initial raids were really impressive on paper, when you actually look at the results,
right? Yeah.
These missions were, the Japanese, like pretty much everybody else, were like, the bomber will always get through. We don't need fighter escorts. They're fast enough to avoid interception. And so they're thrown at these extreme ranges with no fighter escorts. And usually the Navy strikes were at very low altitudes as well to help with accuracy. And also, I haven't read something specifically on this, but I also assume it's probably kind of something born out of their anti-shipping training.
Yeah.
But they'd come in and bomb targets at 650 meters, like right on the deck. And these attacks were predictably absolutely savaged by the Chinese Air Force and anti-aircraft fire. And in the early, in the first few months of the war, the two air groups involved actually lost about literally half their strength, half their operational aircraft, launching these raids, and one was so catastrophic against Nanjing that they pretty much they killed this whole transoceanic bombing thing, and they started moving closer to air bases, and they started introducing fighter escort.
Now, in the defense for the Japanese, we probably should also mention is that when they first launched these kind of transoceanic raids, they didn't actually have the capacity to give them escorts because the escorts didn't have the range. Yeah. And because they didn't actually have any airfields on the mainland of China in the area that the actual aircraft were going to do their bombing. Once that changed, of course, the amount of escorts that were given improved. But as you said, the initial losses that the Japanese actually suffered on those raids are quite staggering for the time. Now we're talking about, I believe it's like 30 to 35 G3Ms that they have lost or something initially?
Yeah, something like that. The numbers when you see in this conflict, like if you're looking at it from, say, the perspective of 1944 or something, they're pretty small. But by the perspective of 1937, like these are actually quite large numbers.
Absolutely. Okay, for the Chinese then, so we've mentioned what the army does, what the navy does. The Chinese, you were saying that they kind of throw in their force wholeheartedly. Not everything goes their way. What really happens once they start losing their initial air bases around Shanghai, around Nanjing? What do they do? How do they cope with this?
Yeah, so the Chinese kind of go all in Shanghai, Nanjing. They really give hell to the Japanese, but the Japanese are also hitting back. And of course, this was not a fair matchup. So eventually what ended up happening is the Chinese Air Force was, at least what they'd had pre-war, had been chewed up almost to extinction. I've seen some figures as I think it was by September 37 or something like that, they were down to like 30 aircraft or something. So it was almost annihilation. And at this point, actually in the background, from August 37, the Soviets and Nationalist China had been talking. They eventually sign a pact. And as part of this kind of alliance, not really an alliance, but like this agreement, Soviet quote-unquote volunteers started to arrive in China. And indeed, they started supplying hundreds of aircraft, all sorts of logistics personnel, advisors, instructors, you name it, including pilots.
Yeah.
And Pilots and aircraft started to arrive right in time to help in the air defense of Nanjing. So what ends up happening is one source basically described it as after the initial Chinese Air Force had been wiped out, the Soviets had practically grew to dominate what was quote unquote the Chinese Air Force. There were still Chinese pilots and things like that fighting, but the Soviets took on actually quite a significant role. So in the air, anyway, it started to become almost a Japanese Soviet conflict, with some Chinese helping them out, particularly anti-aircraft gunners. I guess I'll quickly mention Chenault had actually been brought on as an advisor long before the AVG and things that he was really famous for, and he did a lot to help the Chinese and even the Soviets to a certain extent set up bomber interception. And Nanjing, actually, overall, between German advisors for setting up the ground-based anti-aircraft defense, Chenault coordinating air efforts, and then Soviet assistance, Nanjing was actually quite a heavily defended target to try and bomb, and the Japanese would find this out the hard way, and it was actually quite hard fought.
Yeah. So for a quick note again on the Soviet kind of assistance here, what Justin is saying that this is very quickly grows to be the dominant factor here for the Chinese is very much true. The Soviets, I think the initial figure is that they want to send, or they will send 500 aircraft, roughly 150 so-called volunteers, who were, by the way, rotated. So it's not just 150 guys on a one shot. Overall, they were rotated. And the logistical kind of support and in fact the logistical effort to get all these aircraft to China was quite staggering. I mean, I've read accounts that apparently the Soviets after they've noticed that flying wasn't really an option, also because of the altitudes involved and the weather factors and the meteorological factors on the ground, they would send their aircraft there disassembled. And to do this, they had to construct new roads, they had to construct bridges and tunnels and so on, and they did all this relatively quickly to get all this equipment down there as fast as possible. And it's actually quite staggering, the kind of effort that was put into it. And it's especially staggering because everybody always talks about how much assistance was sent to Spain by the Soviets and, for example, by the Germans. But here's the same thing happening in Asia, and very few people actually talk about it. Now, with the overall communication, the overall structure of the Chinese Air Force at this point, the effort that is being led primarily by the Soviets at this point, how much coordination is there with the other services?
I haven't seen a lot of any significant coordination between the two. The air services, of course, or not air services, the Chinese Air Force and / Soviets. They were primarily doing defense, of course. They were constantly on the defensive, so they were usually defending cities, defending their airfields, etc., from Japanese attacks. They did launch some offensive raids, actually, to a significant degree of success, particularly Soviet volunteers. There's one raid, just for example, quite early on, where SB-2s, which, of course, by the standards of 37, are actually quite modern.
Oh yeah,
they launch quite an effective attack against Japanese air bases on Taiwan, and they come back, and this actually makes a real impression on the Japanese. And there's other raids launched by SB-2s and TB-3s periodically against Japanese airfields that would do a lot of damage, and this kind of foreshadows because the Japanese were very sloppy with airfield defense and construction. And it was already biting them back in 37, 38.
Yeah. So if we continue a little bit on what's happening at the moment, most of you have probably already heard this from what we're essentially saying. At this point, it's very much the Chinese Air Force, as much as it still exists, is fighting predominantly the Navy because the army is still stuck in the north. However, once these cities fall, Shanghai, Nanjing, and the Japanese start driving into mainland China, and of course with the drive also to Wuhan, things start changing quite rapidly again on how the dynamics of the air war are actually conducted. In Wuhan, which Chinese hold for some time, they in fact also try to sort of recuperate from the losses that they have sustained so far. And I think also in Guangdong and was it Chongqing was the new capital after Nanjing fell.
Yeah, the wartime capital for nationalist China. There was an intermediate period where it was. I'm trying to remember it just blanked in my brain. But there's a brief period where the wartime capital moves. I think it was at least in the Wuhan area. It might have been one of the Wuhan is a tri-city.
Yes,
it might have been one of the tri-cities or something. But, eventually, it moves to Chongqing. But in 1938, the big drive, particularly in the air and on the ground, is to capture Wuhan. And this is where you see some very large-scale aerial engagements between Soviet/Chinese and the Japanese. And there's heavy losses on both sides. Actually, in some cases, the Soviets/Chinese actually gain the upper hand and really slap back some Japanese attacks. One time, actually, so badly that the Japanese stop raids for a brief period to recuperate before resuming operations. But ultimately, eventually, Wuhan would fall on the ground and in the air. These grinding, high-intensity air battles would eventually lead the Japanese to gain the upper hand, and they would kind of hold on to that upper hand with some tactical setbacks all the way through to 1941.
Right. So when the capital also moves, maybe one of the things that we could mention is when it moves to Chongqing, there's a lot of flag defenses around that city. It's actually quite impressive how much flag they have, with the Japanese sustaining quite a few losses to those. And the Japanese also developed the Chinese also developed quite a, for the time, sophisticated early warning system that helps them out big time there. And one of the interesting aspects here is really that Japan went into the war hoping to categorically destroy any kind of Chinese air force that was in the existence in 1937. By this point in time, they've gotten very close to it a couple of times, but the Chinese are still holding on and they still have their air bases and they just keep pulling back, recuperating some of their losses, getting foreign equipment especially helps them in this sense. And because they never completely destroy the Chinese Air Force, because there's that foreign influx of know-how and experience and equipment, this is going to bite the Japanese back in the long term. Even you might argue in 1945, when obviously the Chinese Air Force is mainly kitted out with Western and American kit, but because the Japanese never really finish the job, do the coup de grace, they always have that looming threat in the back that the Chinese Air Force still exists on the ground over there and still could come back and potentially be quite a nuisance. Now going through 1939, of course, at this point the war in Europe kicks off. Most nations still at this point don't really look at what's going on in Asia, even though there's actually quite some significant events. For example, the way that Chongqing, the new capital, was bombed, it's probably one of the worst bombings on a city before World War II in the Western sense kind of kicks off. Is that correct?
Yeah, Chongqing is kind of one of those forgotten cities. It was one of the earliest to be, if not the earliest, to be bombed in a sustained fashion. The Japanese, particularly the Navy, which is kind of weird because people usually associate what we would call maybe terror bombing or strategic bombing, which are two different things, but the Japanese kind of did a little bit of both. They associate that with the Army, Air Arm, or an independent air force, but bizarrely for the Japanese, it actually ended up primarily as a Navy job. The Army would help a little later on once they got aircraft that weren't 10 years out of date or something.
Yeah.
Or not 10 years, but 7 years or so out of date.
Now going into 1940, 1941, this is the last final stretch that we're going to touch upon here, is the Japanese are rolling out with some very impressive equipment at this point.
Yeah, so by this point, both Japanese air services have almost completely re-equipped from what they had started the war with. By 1941, the famous G4M Betty was just entering service. It didn't see a lot of service in China. But it was there. In 1940, the Zero made its appearance, which of course is probably the most famous. The Army 2 was introducing new equipment. The Ki-27 made its first appearance in 1938. It wasn't like by European standards, it wasn't absolute top of the line, but it was respectable. The Ki-21 medium bomber had entered service.
Right, and this is actually also kind of a pretty good point to conclude this here, because of the experience that the Japanese have in China, both the army and the navy. Even though not everything goes their way, they have quite a few setbacks, but they also have quite a few impressive moments, like those transoceanic strikes, and this kind of testing ground for themselves for introducing new equipment into a war zone, which generally, especially with what we're going to see forthcoming in the next couple of years when World War II really kicks off, you have these guys that are more experienced and kind of have already an idea of what you're going to be facing in the field, where China was kind of their testing ground, their baptism by fire. Anything beyond really the crew experience, the new kit that comes out, what did the Japanese learn during this time when it comes to aviation, whether it's the Army or the Navy?
Yeah, I guess I'll mention a couple things very quickly. I'm actually writing, for those who don't know, I guess I'm actually writing an article on this that it won't be earth-shattering. It's kind of just taking little tidbits from a lot of works that have already been published and kind of putting it in one place. But the Japanese Air Service has actually learned quite a bit from their experience in China. Some of it good, some of it bad, and some things they chose to ignore. And I mean, it's kind of the same thing with the Western air powers in the Spanish Civil War, as I'm sure Bismarck is abundantly familiar with, where they kind of picked and chose what they wanted to take away from the Spanish Civil War. So for just to pick a couple random examples, the Shotai, which was kind of the basic tactical formation of the both Japanese air services, they had obviously originated from the very tight British Vic that everyone knows. And when they entered the war in 1937, that's kind of what they were using. Although even beyond that, pilot discipline from accounts I've read was poor. So even with the British Vic style Vic, they weren't really holding that formation. They'd kind of be like the stereotype kind of 1v1 duels, and in kind of the World War I fashion, you read accounts of a lone A5M type 96 fighting a lone Chinese fighter in over the skies of Nanjing. As the war continued, they found out the Shotai was too inflexible, so they loosened it significantly, and it very rarely entered combat in a V formation. It would form a very loose line astern or left or right echelon, plenty of spacing. They could watch each other's blind spots, etc. So they reformed it. Of course, people that kind of know a little bit about fighter formations know that the Germans had actually come up with kind of rota, the loose pairs, in the Spanish Civil War, which was a tactically superior formation to even the reformed Shotai. But the Japanese at least took a step in the right direction, just not quite as far as the Germans did.
Yeah, I mean, even with the Germans, it should be said the Germans were not the only ones that came up with it. In fact, recently I discovered that the Finns were already experimenting apparently with a two-man formation at around the same time. The Soviets were as well. And most air forces and most countries actually very quickly realized there was something there, but there's always a little bit of institutional obstructions there that really prevents these kind of changes. And it's like you said, you pick and choose. And some countries chose certain aspects of what they learned in China or in the Spanish Civil War, and then it completely ignored others. And oftentimes those things that they ignored turned out to be actually pretty valid. And sometimes the things they took out of it, like you said with the Shotai now, with the loosened formation, was a valiant attempt to kind of get rid of a latent problem that they were having. However, going forward, it was probably the wrong call. Although it must also be said that with the Shotai that they had, they did actually experience quite a lot of success until it was too late.
Yes.
But yeah, that I think that rounds up off quite nicely. Is there anything that we can say about the Chinese learned at this point? the Chinese effort, as we said, is very disintegrated. It's not centralized as much as it should be. I think going forward, we see two different air forces developing as well in China again. On the one hand side, the Chinese are fractured there as well, but also we have, of course, the AVG coming in and foreign volunteers. But what specifically can we perhaps say that the Chinese have learned from this war?
Unfortunately, I won't be able to go into too much detail on the Chinese side. There's just so little written from their perspective, unfortunately.
That is true.
But I guess one thing to take away is that the Chinese were fighting hard. And they did actually produce some aces. They had some success, as you mentioned earlier. By basically 1940, they were fighting what you could call almost an asymmetric war in the air. They'd withdraw their aircraft. They'd hide them. They'd only launch when it was favorable. They would return to their airfields when it was unfavorable, and it was really excruciatingly frustrating for the Japanese. You can almost feel the frustration. On the part of the Japanese. They're strafing all of these airfields. They're sending in bombers that look unescorted, but they're hiding fighters in clouds nearby to try and sucker the Chinese into coming out to fight them. It was so this kind of like almost in a way fighting dirty or not fighting fair against a much stronger opponent in the air was quite fascinating actually to read up on.
Yeah, it's quite clever actually, some of the things the Chinese did. And of course, a fair fight is not a fight you want to get into. Yep. So all the more power to them. All right. Well, thanks very much, Justin, for taking your time and explaining a few things here about a aspect or an air war that most people don't really talk about that much. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's always a joy to help you or MHV out. So.
Thank you very much. And yeah, of course, we hope that Bernhard is on a speedy way of recovery. You guys will be seeing him certainly in the upcoming days as he's back in action. And I hope you guys enjoyed this little discussion as well. And as always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.